There's an increasing problem now with local authorities taking what were HMO properties and creating 6, 7, 8, maybe 10 or a dozen individual properties for council tax purposes. It's called disaggregation, and basically what happens is the valuation office agency go in and assess a property, an HMO property, and they then disaggregate it into its individual units, hence the phrase disaggregation. So they break it down, and rather than being taxed as one large property, the individual rooms within that property end up with their own council tax banding, inevitably an A banding at the lowest level. And this creates a number of problems for landlords and tenants. A landlord initially has been paying council tax as an HMO, so instantly these properties are rebanded. Responsibility for the council tax then falls on the tenant. That's an issue for the tenant who, there's a reason they were living in an HMO property, and one of those reasons is cost and affordability, and one of those reasons is the council tax already taken care of, and now suddenly they're left with responsibility for council tax. It will be at a much higher rate than they were paying before. Before they might be paying 1/6 or 1/10 of maybe a Band E property, and now suddenly they're paying all of a Band A property. So there's a real issue there in terms of affordability for tenants in these properties that have become disaggregated. There's also potentially an issue for the landlord who has maybe continued to pay council tax on the property, but it's been disaggregated. Tenants don't realise they're responsible sometimes, so either the landlord can end up paying 6 or 8 or 10 Band A council taxes, which will be an awful lot more than the one Band E or F they were paying before, or the tenants don't pay, and ultimately, as we know, councils go to the one person they know they can find and know they can get council tax off of, which is inevitably the landlord. So it creates all sorts of problems. But I think the real issue here is the consistency with which this is applied. There seems to be no rhyme or reason over what properties are disaggregated and which continue to be banded as an HMO. There are some key tests that the VOA claim to use, which is round about with ensuite accommodation, if there is cooking facilities, for example, if there's no shared facilities other than perhaps a common room or a lounge, that can quite often lead to disaggregation. But when you read the VOA's guidance on council tax banding, the default position seems to be disaggregation. It seems to be to break up these larger HMO properties into individual council tax Band A properties. And there's another incentive here that perhaps isn't obvious but for councils, because there's a thing called the New Homes Bonus, and that is counted on the number of council tax properties, and it means that if councils create new homes and new dwellings, we're in the midst of a housing crisis, then they get to keep some of that council tax. So there's a real incentive there for councils to have properties disaggregated. It will mean more council tax overall because you're creating more units, but also when it comes to submitting figures to government, that looks like they've actually created new homes where they haven't, and it qualifies them for this thing called the New Homes Bonus. So there's a real perverse incentive there from a landlord point of view for councils to break up HMOs. They get more council tax, they get the New Homes Bonus, but ultimately it leaves landlords with a real headache. Do they pass the cost on to the tenants and continue paying the much increased council tax themselves, or do they allow the tenants to register for council tax in these units, as they should under the law, and risk the tenants looking to move somewhere else because of the cost of the property? And we have had members come to us who have lost tenants because of disaggregation, because simply by the time you add the council tax onto the property, which can be an extra £500, £600, £700 a year, then the property is no longer affordable. And the attraction in that property offer in the first instance was the fact it was low cost, it was affordable, and things like bills and council tax were rolled up into one. It gave the tenant certainty about their income and outgoings rather. And in these circumstances, it's often vulnerable tenants we're talking about. So, it's might be all very well for the council to perhaps get an extra 5 council tax units, get its hands on the new homes bonus, but ultimately they're potentially creating homelessness issues if these vulnerable tenants can't continue to afford the rent, run into arrears, run into council tax debt, and present as homeless to the council. So there needs to be a real rethink here. The RLA has been in discussion with the Valuation Office Agency for 18 months now, trying to get progress on this. We want to see a consistent stance taken where landlords can have clarity as to whether, if they do works in their HMO to improve them, to make things better for the tenants there, whether it's an ensuite or some cooking facilities within the room, that they won't be clobbered with disaggregation. We want some certainty that those landlords have already made improvements, can know whether they're going to see their property split up into individual council tax units, and also to give tenants certainty as well going forward. So we'd like to see some sort of consistency of approach, but we also think it's a piece of nonsense for basically a room in an HMO to be banded the same as a small flat or a 2-bedroom terrace when it clearly isn't. So we think the government perhaps needs to look at this and consider whether, where these sorts of properties are being broken down for council tax purposes, where they are being disaggregated, as to whether a lower council tax ban should be introduced and applied, perhaps a 50% rate similar to that that's applied to annexes or granny flats.